Mark 1. Conversations at the speed of sound.
The operator had to get in. We had a generator to give him light. We had a fan because it was, one, it was fairly warm in the time, and secondly, it was in there was no other air. He spent a day and a half in there. His knuckles were red raw, his shins were there, and as I said, there was well over 100 bolts that he had to undo, none of which were easy. None of the bolts at any stage were easy because they'd been there for that long and they'd sweated in.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Mach 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. My name is Gary Hills. I am happy to say that I am a QAM volunteer, and I will be your host for this final of 3 episodes focusing on the QAM Lockheed P-3C Orion A9760. A couple of weeks ago I spoke with Maurice Ritchie, who, as a Royal Australian Air Force pilot, flew the Orions, and before that the Neptunes. Then you heard from Peter Scovell, who was a flight engineer on the Orions, and from Chris Bewley, who was an aircraft technician. Today you're going to hear from a QAM volunteer by the name of Ted Gray, who meticulously recorded in photographic and written form the process by which A9760, having arrived at Maroochydore, was dismantled, trucked to Caloundra, and then reassembled. Let me tell you a little bit about that story so that you have the facts straight, and all of this comes directly from the excellent history that has been compiled on the QAM website under Collections by QAM historian Ron Cuskelly, providing in great detail the provenance of this aircraft. Let me just read you the final part from that. Now, in April of 2018, A9760 arrived at Sunshine Coast Airport, that's Maroochydore, from RAAF Edinburgh in South Australia. Now, there had been a planned practice approach to Caloundra with a flypast over the Queensland Air Museum, which had to be abandoned because of thunderstorm activity over Caloundra, much to the disappointment of the volunteers who had gathered at QAM to photograph the low flyover, which unfortunately was not to be. The aircraft flew on then to Maroochydore, landed on runway 18, and shut down for the final time on the 18th of April 2018 at 12:03 p.m. with, would you believe it, 14,400 pounds of fuel remaining in the wings. Now, by that time, the time of its final shutdown, the aircraft had 14,888.9 hours to its credit, having arrived in Australia in 1979. A couple of months later, after having been demilitarised by a crew from Airbus, A9760 was formally handed over to the Queensland Air Museum on the 11th of June 2018. Now, it wasn't until 4 months later, in October 2018, that the aircraft was finally able to be defueled and the deconstruction could begin in earnest. And it was almost exactly a full year after that, so October 2019, when the engines and props arrived at QAM Caloundra, and about a week later the fuselage arrived also, and the night following that, or the early hours of the following morning, the wings were delivered. Now, all of the components of the aircraft were trucked to Caloundra by Clayton's Towing on semi-trailers, expertly driven by Clayton's driver Max Quaglio, an inspirational local legend who refuses to accept that cerebral palsy is a disability. A remarkable driver. Somewhat remarkable in the same sense as my son Christopher, who as a 26-year-old equally refuses to accept that his cerebral palsy is a disability. Despite being quadriplegic, he is a very successful young man running a business and video editor. Christopher likes to say, disability my ass. But I digress. 5 months after delivery of these components to the QAM in Caloundra, so we're in March of 2020, a final load consisting of the tail group, which had remained at Maroochydore, was moved to Caloundra. 6 months after that, so we're now in September of 2020, the rear fuselage, the empennage, and the magnetic anomaly detector boom, the tail stinger, were finally reattached, and A9760 was intact. Now, for the next 20 or so minutes, you're going to hear from Ted Gray, who kept a record of this amazing process, and I caught up with him recently at the Queensland Air Museum. Well, I'm sitting in Hangar 2 at the Queensland Air Museum with a gentleman by the name of Ted Gray, who is a QAM volunteer. G'day, Ted.
G'day, Gary. Happy to be here. Hey, it's great with all these planes around. It's fantastic.
It's an excellent place to sit, isn't it? I mean, it's a unique kind of a space to be in. And so I thought if we sat here, we could talk about our topic today, which we will come to in a moment. But first of all, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? Where are you from and what's your background?
Okay, originally a Queenslander. To my horror, I had to spend over 50 years in Victoria. Was able to escape about 4.5 years ago, back up here. And one of the things I did when I first got here was to become a member of a volunteer at the Queensland Air Museum, the QAM.
And what were you doing here as a volunteer?
Well, there was very little I could do initially, apart from helping out selling raffle tickets and things like that. But when the Orion project first came up, I contacted a few of the people involved and asked if I could cover it to write the story and take the photographs of the Orion itself. They totally agreed, and I spent not quite the same time as the volunteer crew who worked on the aircraft, but nevertheless, I was there for a very long time up at the airport, the Sunshine Coast Airport, where the aircraft was initially, and then when it came down and be rebuilt. So that was my involvement, and basically really my only involvement till now with QAM.
And you've provided us with a chronicle of a photographic record, pretty much, haven't you, of the process by which that aircraft was disassembled, reassembled here. How many photos do you reckon you took?
I totaled them up. The ones that I've kept, and I've probably dumped a few, was around about 1,500 photos altogether. But a lot of them were, as with photography when you've got time, is take 2 or 3 from slightly different angles and so on. So they weren't totally unique photos of 1,500 of them.
And I know that in Hangar 1 at the QAM we have a rolling display of images on a big screen, and part of that is the Orion, and a number of photographs are there for our visitors to see. But you have a far more comprehensive record than that, and I guess one of the challenges is how best to preserve and display that, and that I guess will come in time. But you have gone to the trouble of producing a written account too, a booklet, with some of these photographs, and it's that I'd like to talk to you about today, because that record is fascinating to me. We're going to talk about the process whereby this Lockheed Orion was flown from Edinburgh in South Australia to the Maroochydore Sunshine Coast Airport, and then how it got 35 kilometres away, roughly, to the Queensland Air Museum. So let's talk about that story. So Ted, in 2018, I think it was, they flew into Maroochydore. Why did they fly there instead of to Caloundra Airport?
Well, basically the plane was, the aircraft was too big, too heavy, and not only that, it's a light airport at Caloundra, and even if they'd been able to put the plane down, we couldn't have got across the road without demolishing a whole series of buildings, telephone lines, you name it, and it just wasn't practical.
And I think even as it was getting into Maroochydore, they had to take down part of the perimeter fence to park it somewhere, didn't they?
Yeah, well, initially we weren't allowed to store it on the tarmac at the airport, and we put down our own hard standing area outside of that to allow us to do all the preliminary work, and that was, again, the fence came down, the plane was towed out, and all the preliminary work was done. And that was actually a part that I actually missed physically because I wasn't there at the time. But that was when the rain came, and the hard standing area stood up to it, but access to it was such that our vehicles were bogged and had to be pulled out by four-wheel drives. The crew were wearing gumboots to go to work. I'm glad I missed that bit, Gary.
So this is 2019.
Yes, early that year. There was an open day for the members to go up and climb all over it on that outside hard standing area. And it was an interesting time because what was being done was there was a whole lot of guys doing lots and lots of work, but very hard to see exactly what they were doing, because what they were doing was to remove a whole series of panels to be able to disconnect all the wires, leads, hoses, you name it, so that the part could happen. And the other main thing that happened there was the flush of the fuel tank.
Now this is interesting. Yes, let's talk about the fuel tank in one moment, because that's a great part of this story. It was fascinating. I'd never even heard of this before. Did the RAAF, I presume they removed anything from it that they wanted or didn't want anybody to know about? Would that be right?
As far as I know, it was clean-skinned when we got it, yes.
And did the RAAF assist with this at all, or was it entirely over to you?
They basically left it all to us. They did supply very, very comprehensive drawings, instructions and so on, and they also supplied subsequently the cradles on which the aircraft stood.
So these are cradles for the engines and for the fuselage?
Yeah, basically, obviously things like the wings had to be supported for removal. You couldn't just undo them and let them drop. So, they were the specific cradles for it.
So let's talk about why would you, obviously you have to drain the fuel tank. I can understand you don't want fuel in it, but why would you have to flush the tank out? What was its role in this whole process?
Well, that actually came a bit later because to remove the wings, the outside of the fuel tank where the wings were was actually the seal of the fuel tank. So to get at the bolts holding the wings on, the guys had to get into the fuel tank and undo the bolts from inside, and fairly obviously you wouldn't want to have gas fumes in there while guys were spending 2 or 3 days working.
And how big are these tanks?
Not very big. The guys in there, I christened them the human pretzels. And they really were, because inside the fuel tank were a whole heap of struts supporting it. So they had to work in and around, and we're jumping ahead a bit to taking the wings off, but some of the bolts were incredibly tight and difficult after 20, 30 years or whatever it was of being in place, and had to be knocked out with sledgehammers. And you didn't have a big swing room there, and it was a very painstaking job to get those bolts undone so the wing could come off.
I think I read in your booklet that there is something like a 50 centimetre high space within the tank or something, and no more than that. Is that right?
It wouldn't have been much more than that, obviously. I'm trying to think, and I'm not sure whether I've put it down in record, but I think it was probably around about 2.5 metres square by, as you say, about 50 centimetres high. with struts going crisscrossing, so the guys had to get in and around and be able to whack these very hard to remove bolts. I'm glad I didn't have a microphone in there, because some of the language might have been quite interesting and not for recording.
Well, we could always give a language warning. I'm sure that was colourful. I don't suppose anybody, it's a silly question in a way, but anybody kept track of how many actual bolts had to be undone and reconnected?
The answer was yes, there was, but I don't have that record. On another area which we can come to later on, I know there were well over 100 bolts just for the one assembly, and all of them were difficult to remove, and they were another difficult area.
So what did you do with the bolts? How did you get them out when they were jammed?
Right. Now that was, again, the leading guy on the aircraft at that stage was Bruce Small, and everything that was removed was ticketed and put in little plastic bags which were numbered, and the numbers related to the area that they went in, because they weren't all the same size. It was a marvellous effort, the way it was all done, so when it came to be replaced, we knew what bolt was going in where.
Were you able to replace the original bolts? I guess some of them had to be drilled out and had to be, you'd have to find new ones to replace them, were they?
Well, some of them were, and because the aircraft was never going to be flyable, we won't tell anyone in the public, and we won't tell anyone here. No one's listening to us now, so there were a few that weren't replaced at all.
That's right. So let's say you get these bolts off from a section that has to be removed. Is that the end of the story? Once the bolts are off, can it then be moved away, or are there more challenges than that?
Well, apart from one area, and I'd like to come back to the empennage, which is the tail fin assembly. No, once they were done, it was a matter of then a bit of manipulation, because these things had been sealed, obviously. The seals had to be broken. A bit of manipulation by the crane or the fork truck, whichever was being used, to actually break the necessary components away from the aircraft. They could then easily be removed.
Now, this whole process is taking months, like it's, I think, February through to October 2019. Yes. How often were you guys out there? Wasn't every day, I'm sure?
Twice a week, up at, and it was twice a week up there, except on occasions where it had to be done in a hurry, because there were bits that needed to be properly removed, couldn't be left dangling.
So you're removing them in a certain order because there's a logical and safe way to do that. And when you remove a large component, how do you store it, or do you move it, relocate it to Caloundra immediately?
Depends on the components. When the engines were removed, they were actually, by that stage when the engines were removed, we were able to get back onto the tarmac at the airport proper, and the authorities gave us access to a very large hangar and workshop, which was fantastic. I don't think we could have done without it. So all the engines were stored until they were ready to go on the truck and brought back down to Caloundra.
Well, kudos to the Sunshine Coast Airport Authority for being so cooperative about a thing like this, because I'm sure they would be very happy to have it off their property as soon as possible.
Well, once we got to that stage, they made sure we got it off very quickly, and the lasting memory was the wings and the fuselage on very, very large Clayton's long loaders, driving out from the airport, and the tarmac was suddenly clear. There was only a few accessories that needed to come from the hangar. Hey, goodbye Sunshine Coast Airport.
And I believe they were trucked down the Nicklin Way. That must have made for quite a spectacle.
Well, I was able to stop at Kawana, because it was going through the big shopping complex there, to take a photo of this whopping big thing following and being followed by pilot vehicles. And I don't know, it just seemed to happen. The traffic you couldn't really pass the aircraft because it was wide enough that it was blocking off a couple of lanes. But it kept moving very, very well. It had to stop at traffic lights. They weren't police controlled. The driver did a brilliant job. And when he got here to the museum area, he had to come in from a narrow street in through a narrow gate with this huge long trailer behind him. Not a scratch. Not a scratch. And brought it in, and obviously the cranes were waiting, so they unloaded it.
Volunteering can be good for your physical health and mental well-being. Get active and get involved with interesting tasks, significant and important projects, and meet new people by joining the volunteers at the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. We're all volunteers here. Whether it's in our restoration workshops and our aero engine shop, restoring and maintaining airframes and engines, as well as our grounds and buildings, or in our library, boasting one of the largest and most significant collections of RAAF materials in Australia, with tens of thousands of items to be catalogued, administered and cared for. Or on our front counter, providing excellent customer service to our visitors. There's a place for you. It could be 1 day a week or 7. We will train you and equip you for the area that suits you best. Get in touch through our website. We would love to hear from you. Become a volunteer at the Queensland Air Museum, Caloundra. Unless you get a sense of how big this aircraft is, I don't think it sinks in what a mammoth task, this has been. Now, let's go back again a fraction to where we were with the disassembly. What happened with the propellers? Were they removed separately?
3 of them were. Y3 with a 4 engine. 3 were removed and put on the truck. The 4th one stayed on the engine, and the reason was that particular engine there was only one correct cradle to hold an engine with the propeller. So the engine and its propeller, why bother moving a propeller when you didn't have to? It was one less job to be done. And that was a lovely cradle. So the cradle and all and the other 3 engines subsequently came down. The propellers were taken down quite earlier.
And you're using cranes or forklifts? How are you raising and lowering these loads?
It depends obviously on the unit. Cranes for the big ones. Universal Cranes guys were unbelievably cooperative, and otherwise it was the forklift with a lot of it was with a cage that goes up so they could get access to it. With the wings, they were on their cradles, which were on wheels. So once they were disassembled, they could be pulled sideways. Now, the first one didn't have a lot of room between it and the fence, and the fork truck had real problems. So we solved the problem very easily. The second one, we just hooked up one of the guys' four-wheel drives with a rope and towed it out. It worked, and it was obviously because the tarmac was very smooth and very level. It was very easy to do. From there, it was lifted off the cradle onto a truck, and subsequently, and the cradles were brought back separately here, because obviously it had to be put back on the cradle when we got back here.
Now, I believe the empennage, the tail assembly, the tail section,
Yes.
Presented some challenges, a number of them. Can you tell us about that process?
That was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever seen in my life in any context. The access was through a small hole in the bottom of the empennage. The bolts had to be done from within the empennage because the bulkhead on the aircraft was solid. So it had to be unbolted from there. The operator had to get in. We had a generator to give him light. We had a fan because it was, one, it was fairly warm in the time, and secondly, it was in there was no other air. He spent a day and a half in there. His knuckles were red raw, his shins were there, and as I said, there was well over 100 bolts that he had to undo, none of which were easy. None of the bolts at any stage were easy because they'd been there for that long and they'd sweated in. So now, having finally got it to break away, it was then put on a crane, or lifted by the crane and put on a cradle beside the aircraft. From there, the aircraft was then towed back onto the tarmac, and the empennage was sitting there on its own glory. Subsequently, when we tried to remove it, now this was watching the guys trying to work out if you put the tail planes along the low loader, the fin stuck up too high to transport. If you tried to lay the fin down, the tailplane stuck out too far on the side. The fin had to be removed. Undid all the necessary bolts, drilled out the rivets, went to lift it, and they found that there were 6 rivets that weren't on the drawing. So back down again. About that time, they got all the rivets undone and the bolts undone, went to lift it, and this was getting late-ish in an afternoon, and the wind got up to over 40 knots, which precludes a crane lifting anything, because you can imagine this very large tailplane swinging around, people trying to hold it and guide it. We'd have had half a dozen operatives probably being battered into the next suburb. So the crane operators quite justified and said, right. So we left it there and continued on with the other work. I think from memory, and I'm pretty sure my memory's good enough, the whole of the aircraft was brought down and got in here the day before COVID restrictions came in, which means that the airport was, the museum was closed down, our operators couldn't go back to Caloundra, so the thing sat there for a couple of months. Went back up again subsequently and tried to lift it, and it still didn't lift. What wasn't shown on the drawing, and what wasn't until we lifted it up enough for vision, was that there were about 5 angle irons, quite long, probably 3/4 of a metre, going from the top of the tail fin down into the body of the empennage. And because it was quite impossible to give a straight vertical lift, you'd get several of them free and one of them would jam. Okay, the final solution, angle grinder, chop off the one that was jamming. So eventually, the 2 components of the empennage, the fins and the tail planes, were put on trucks and brought back down here, which would finally be able to be reassembled.
And putting it back together was a bit more straightforward?
Most of the time, yes. A lot of it, because we knew what we were doing, the only thing I can recall that really was a problem was putting the port wing on, which went on first, and the hard standing area we had was it was pretty good. In fact, considering we had to do it ourselves and so on, but it wasn't quite flat and it wasn't quite level. The cradles were very big and very heavy with great big iron wheels which didn't turn easily. So we got the port wing in and most of the bolts done up, but no matter what we did, there was probably about a 1.5 centimetre gap at the leading edge that bolts wouldn't pull it up. And with a lot of fiddling, what was done was they actually twisted the wing slightly by dropping the nose jack down a bit and moving the cradle up and down and round until it finally just slotted into place. What we learnt from that, of course, meant that the port wing, they were able to get it on pretty easily. Most of the rest of it was really, again, getting into fiddly areas and getting bolts to attach and all those sort of things. So really, putting it together was a lot of solid work, but not really very many problems.
Now, you mentioned the shutdown with COVID and so on, and that delayed the process, but I believe it was between November 2019 and September 2020, that reassembly process. So it took almost a year with those shutdowns in the middle. So it was still a huge task, wasn't it? You talk about that tail assembly sitting there by itself at the Maroochydore Airport on the grass, I think, wasn't it, outside the fence. I saw a Google Maps photograph of that airport taken, I think, about 2020, or it must have been 2019 now, I guess. And you could clearly see this huge tail sitting on the grass there all by itself, and that was the Orion's tail. Why, now that it's all assembled and it's on display and it's being maintained and it's a magnificent thing, why is it all grey?
Right. Well, it used not to be. The Air Force, when they were in the Middle East conflict, I'm not sure which one, but they were there. The aircraft actually of that squadron were all given names. Our name was Brooke, and they were fairly brightly painted. The Chimera logo on the tailplane was very clear, along with the Air Force rondelles and all the other things, quite bright. And the Air Force suddenly thought, well, hey, we're making ourselves a nice target. So everything was removed from there and painted a very nondescript grey. The logo, the Chimera logo, is there, but very indistinct. And if you looked at its earlier brother, the Neptune, here, you'll see that the same Chimera logo was there, but it's bright black and white. So that was just one of those things that the Air Force decided, and where it is now is the way it was. It hasn't been not looked after or anything of that nature.
So it's not a primer coat, it's actually the way it would have been in service, in operation in the Middle East.
Oh, the way we got it was absolutely operational, yes.
Tell us a little bit about this Chimera, the logo. It's a strange looking thing, isn't it? What does that display?
Right, well, I admit to being wrong on that. I've been a scuba diver for many, many years, seen quite a number of sharks and seen films of sharks and so on. And when I saw this, it looked like a shark, but it had an exceptionally long tail, which I had never seen. And I got on to the historian of the squadron that flew these planes, and apparently the Chimera is a very deep water shark. So that's why it threw me a little bit. I've never been that deep. And of course the spear was the concept of the aircraft downing the submarines or whatever. So that's the logo.
It's a wonderful image, you know. It's really draws your attention, but of course it's a dull, as you say, a dull black on the dull grey as part of the livery for a purpose, for a reason. I believe it was early 2021 that the Orion was open to the public, or was fully on display for the public. So it's been there now for just over a year. We're recording in the middle of 2022. What's the future for it? Is there more to be done, or is it pretty much as it needs to be now?
The last I heard, they were hooking up some electrics that they could run a bit more of the electrical gear, the wiring and so on. The very last thing they were able to do was actually open the bomb bay doors, because they had to have the hydraulics working. They could open them, couldn't close it without the hydraulics. And
I believe there was some suspicion that it may have been full of rubbish, or you wouldn't have known what was in there.
Well, that's correct, mainly because a couple of the other aircraft were, and when they opened it, the guys underneath got rather showered with a lot of rubbish, as you say. But ours was beautifully clean, and it was quite a display. And we had these our photograph of a few of the crews standing there. No bombs dropping on them, which was probably a good thing.
That's the best thing. Thanks, Ted. This has been fascinating. I once disassembled and tried to reassemble and restore a Series 2 Land Rover from 1959, and my strongest memory of the entire process is not just bolts that would not undo, but a row of bolts that you could undo, and then there was always one or maybe two, and they would not. And so do you have an enduring memory from this whole huge process of the relocation of the Orion?
Well, the one thing that we didn't cover was when putting the empennage back on, had to get onto the top of the aircraft, and the scaffolding was built on each side coming over the top, and to get from one side to the other was just walking across the top of the aircraft. And there is unless it's faded away now, there was a beautiful image of a boot right on the top of the aircraft. I don't think anyone of the public is likely to come across this. So, but that was quite an interesting experience in itself. To answer your question, probably the one I come back to was the actual undoing of all the bolts to separate the empennage, and the other area was the difficulty in just getting that tailplane off the empennage assembly.
The Orion is not normally open because at this point we don't have quite enough guides on duty all of the time to open all of the aircraft. But on open cockpit weekends, I know that the plan is to have the Orion open. It was open at the last engine run day, and some of the guys who are still maintaining the display make a point of being here, conducting tours inside the aircraft, and it's the most fascinating space in there. It's huge, isn't it? Like, there's room to manoeuvre, it's quiet, it's insulated. And so keep an eye on the QAM website for news about when our next open cockpit or engine alive day will be. Chances are, if you make it down here, somebody will be able to take you into the Orion and show you around, possibly someone who served in that particular aircraft as well. Ted, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, mate. Well, I mean, I know we've only scratched the surface, but it was only meant to be just a quick summary of a very large job, a job well done, and you must be proud.
Look, I was proud and excited. It was a boy's toy to me. I love aircraft, and I've never been able to fly one, but just as you say, this huge aircraft, to watch it being pulled into every single component, put on trucks, brought down here and it was fabulous to be able to cover that. And as I said, with 1,500 photographs, a written story on it, great excitement, Gary.
This has been great, Ted. Thank you.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed it, reliving the memory. Thanks, Gary.
So that's our episode. Thank you for listening. Next week you're going to hear excerpts from a visit that the Queensland Air Museum recently hosted of some 150 to 200 scouts who came for their air activities weekend. And they did all kinds of things, and it was just wonderful to have them as part of the Air Museum that weekend, including sleeping in the hangar, flying aircraft, flying drones, building aircraft, and flying simulators, all kinds of things. So you're going to hear about their event next week. I just wandered around and captured some of their perspectives and some of their stories, and I found it fascinating, and I hope you will too. So don't forget, the Queensland Air Museum is open from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day, except Christmas Day and Easter Friday, and we would love to meet you. Come in and see us soon. Bye for now.